Now we move on. The third presentation is actually joint presentation by Mr. Zebulun Kreiter and Ms. Nguyen. Mr. Kreiter, Economic Affairs Officer, Office of the Deputy Executive Secretary of CEPAL, and Ms. Nguyen, Sustainable Development Officer, Office of the Executive Secretary of ESCAP. One from speaking from Santiago, Chile, the other speaking from Bangkok, Thailand. Their topic is social and economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and recovery in Fealac. Please go ahead, Mr. Kreiter, first.
Thank you very much, Professor. Good morning to some, good evening to others. My name is Zebulun Kreiter. I'm an Economic Affairs Officer with the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. And today I'll be presenting jointly with my colleague Nguyen of ESCAP on the topic of the socioeconomic impacts and integrated responses to the COVID-19 pandemic in Fealac, covering both impacts and policies in Asia Pacific as well as Latin America and the Caribbean. We'll begin with a brief overview of what some of the socioeconomic impacts have been in terms of economic indicators, social indicators, as well as environmental. And then we'll go into what some of the responses that governments have taken in both regions are. And that will be followed by a brief overview of what some of the policy priorities should be going forward before looking at what some potential areas for future research might be that can help us better identify what those ways forward are. So in this first section, looking at the socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19 in both Asia Pacific and Latin America and the Caribbean, we start by seeing that the global impacts of the pandemic will be unlike anything we've seen in a very long time. According to the Global Economic Prospects Report in June of the World Bank, global GDP is expected to fall by 5.2% in 2020. And GDP will shrink in 90% of countries around the world. This will be 7% in developed economies and 1.6% in emerging economies. But there is high downside risk in all of these. And as my colleague earlier presented from ADB, the forecasts have continued to be revised downwards. In terms of impacts in Asia and Pacific, ESCAP just yesterday released its new report in terms of what the projections are for 2020. It indicates that there will be a steep decline in GDP growth across all of the subregions in Asia Pacific, and the slowdown is expected to be the worst since the 1970s. The latest forecasts, which were released just this week, indicate that the economy should contract by 1.8% in 2020, which is a very large contrast to the 4.3% growth witnessed in 2019. These impacts, however, are heterogeneous. They're not the same across countries and subregions. For example, North and Central Asia is facing the double hit of both slowdown in economic activities, as well as the oil price crash, which will drive contraction to be even larger in that subregion. Moving to Latin America and the Caribbean, the colleague from Flaxo cited some figures earlier in terms of projections, and we've continued to revise downwards our projections at ECLAC. We're currently forecasting a contraction of 9.1% in GDP in 2020. But as you can see, there is heterogeneity, but unlike in other regions where some countries will experience growth in Latin America and the Caribbean, Guyana is the only country which is anticipated to grow due to the recent exploitation of natural gas reserves that were found in the country. Everywhere else throughout the region, however, we're anticipating contraction, unlike we've seen for any time in recent history. In terms of sub-regional variation, South America, due to its reliance on commodity exports, is expected to fall the most. And overall, in 2020, it's anticipated to be the worst contraction in GDP since ECLAC's historical series began in 1951. As I alluded to earlier, these effects are not homogeneous across countries, and that's largely to do with the different sectors that are affected. We see that in terms of both, COVID has affected both supply and demand, and the disruption to supply chains and lower demand for commodities has affected many countries in Asia and Pacific. Traditional services sectors are very labor intensive, and the drastic impact that the pandemic has had on these sectors has led to higher effects on unemployment. Services are labor intensive, and manufacturing comprises 80% of Asia Pacific's informal sector and small and medium enterprises. There's also an unprecedented crisis to the tourism sector, and this figure here shows the relative dependence that different Asia Pacific countries and regions have on tourism. And in this case, certain countries such as Maldives and Thailand are particularly affected, as are many small Pacific Island economies. Many of the transmission channels that have impacted the economies of Asia Pacific are also impacting the economies of Latin America and the Caribbean. The main channels externally before the pandemic arrived to the shores of Latin America and the Caribbean came through the fallen commodity prices, which many countries, particularly in South America, but also to some extent in Central America and other subregions, are dependent on, as well as the drop in foreign demand, but also the reduction in tourism demand has greatly affected certain subregions such as the Caribbean, as well as remittances. And so, as you can see on the left panel here, it shows the varying dependence that different countries in the region have on these flows of foreign exchange, essentially, or sources of foreign exchange, in terms of the overall percent that they contribute to GDP. And you can see that those countries that are highly dependent on commodity exports, remittances, and travel and tourism are particularly affected. And the right-hand panel shows our most recent projections for exports in 2020, which are expected to fall by 23% this year. Now, it should be noted that the impacts of the pandemic are by no means homogeneous across groups. Some groups are much more vulnerable than others. On the previous slide, I spoke a little bit about the vulnerability of tourism-dependent countries. And one thing that is worth noting is that women, for example, account for 60% of employees in the region in accommodation and food services. And so when we look at what the economic sectoral impacts are, they often have disproportionate impacts on certain vulnerable groups. And so this slide shows what that matrix of vulnerability looks like. And in particular, although there's been tremendous progress in poverty reduction and human development in Asia Pacific in particular, millions of people are still lacking access to affordable healthcare. Estimates show that in Asia Pacific, 4 in 10 people have no access to universal healthcare, which has made disease detection, treatment, and recovery difficult to predict. And in addition, over 60% of the Asia Pacific population lacks access to social protection, as do almost the 70% of all workers in the informal sector. Given the impacts to the informal sector and SMEs of the pandemic in terms of bearing the brunt of the economic fallout, many workers will not be able to sustain themselves given the drop in living standards. So just to briefly show, in Latin America and the Caribbean, the poverty rate is expected to rise by 7.1 percentage points in 2020 to 37.3% of the population. And that's an increase of 45.4 million people for a total of 231 million people living in poverty. And so that as a percentage increase is very substantial. And at the same time, extreme poverty is expected to increase by 4.5 percentage points, representing an increase of 28.5 million for a total of 96 million people in the region who will be living in extreme poverty in 2020 in Latin America and the Caribbean. At the same time, inequality is also anticipated to rise. with an approximate 5% increase in the regional average Gini index. If we are looking, though, at environmental impacts, there's been a slight benefit or reduction in air pollution, at least, as we can see in the panel here. Despite the terrible impact that the pandemic has had, both in terms of health and socioeconomic impacts, the temporary suspension of business activities and the closure of public spaces has reduced particulate matter concentration, which is the variable charted here, and shown that it's possible to potentially lock in these environmental gains in the recovery from the pandemic. And so perhaps there are learnings that we can draw from the experience in the past few months that we can carry forward as we develop policies to emerge from the pandemic. And now I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Van, who will present the next section.
Thank you, Zeb. Good morning and good evening to all colleagues in Latin America and in Asia and the Pacific. Allow me to share a few broad brushes of the responses that Fealac governments and countries have undertaken to cope with the impacts of COVID-19. So in terms of responses, in Fealac countries, governments have responded with unprecedented measures to address the health and the socio-economic impacts of the crisis. In Latin America and the Caribbean, for example, the scale of the response already exceeds the region's response in the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. In Asia and the Pacific, since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, all countries in the region have rolled out policy measures to save lives and to support affected businesses and households. So allow me to share a few broad brushes. Next slide. In terms of containment measures, sorry, can we go back, please? In terms of containment measures, earlier in the presentation from the colleague in ADB, we've seen the stringency of the lockdowns in Asia. This is a snapshot of the containment measures that our policy response tracker has captured as consolidated from our region in Asia and the Pacific. So here we see a wide range of containment measures undertaken across countries. Many have aimed at lowering the likelihood of importing the virus by imposing travel restrictions or border closure. Others have attempted to contain the risk of transmitting of community transmission, with the most popular measures being such as social distancing, school closures, and closure of public spaces. We also see a little bit of a discrepancy in terms of the number of countries undergoing mass testing on contact tracing in Asia and the Pacific compared with other measures. Moving on, besides the containment measures, we've seen also countries in the region have quickly rolled out stimulus packages to help affected businesses and households. And from both the presentation by the colleague in ADB and also our presentation thus far, we've seen the magnitude of socio-economic impact with multiple shocks on the economy, and also significant impact on our people. So the size of the fiscal stimulus packages differs across regions, across the region, with a median of around 5.3%. This is as of the 15th of July, 2020. And also of note is that the scale of the stimulus packages also varies across sub-regions, with the largest, as you can see here, the largest scale reported in East and Northeast Asia. So a deeper dive into these stimulus packages also show, you can see here, it shows a key component of prioritized support to the healthcare system to fight COVID-19 pandemic. So most countries in the region, almost all, have allocated resources to strengthen the health responses. And we've also seen that almost all countries have rolled out support to businesses with various measures. For example, subsidizing utilities and rentals, subsidizing loans or loan repayment deferrals, or tax exemptions, to name a few. So, and we also see that support was also targeted at small and medium enterprises as a key actor in the economic system. And in terms of protecting people, we see a host of measures ranging from helping employees with wage subsidies, providing additional social assistance, direct cash transfer, and food provision to households. So these measures have been introduced. In addition to that, monetary policy measures were also introduced to avoid credit crunch and to provide more liquidity. This is also another snapshot from our policy tracker, the tracker of policy responses in Asia and the Pacific. And it shows that expansionary monetary policy stance is observed across countries with interest cuts, with open market operations and special financing facility to improve liquidity conditions in our economies. So now allow me to hand over to Zeb to continue the presentation with the snapshots of responses in Latin America.
Thank you, Ven. As Ven mentioned before, the response in Latin America has been unprecedented. It has outweighed the response to the 2008-2009 financial crisis. And in some select cases, in the case of El Salvador, has amounted to over 10% of GDP in terms of the fiscal response to the pandemic. And it should be kept in mind that this is amidst difficult fiscal conditions in which most countries in the region do not have much fiscal space. And similarly, the measures have been taken to support health services, support household incomes, as well as protect productive capacities to ensure that they are preserved for once economies restart, that social, human, and productive capital is not lost. Some of the policies that governments have implemented in terms of strengthening health system capacity includes scaling up recruitment, special grants for health personnel, increased purchases of medical supplies, as well as increased transfers to subnational governments to strengthen subnational health systems. At the same time, governments have supported household incomes through temporary reductions in the value-added tax on basic necessities, unconditional special grants, as well as the strengthening of existing as well as new transfer programs. And we've seen upwards of 50 million beneficiaries in the region who have benefited from these transfers to sustain livelihoods. In terms of productive capacities, some of the policies that governments in the region have implemented include subsidies for payrolls, purchases, soft loans, as well as credit guarantees and capital injections to ensure that companies remain solvent throughout the crisis. And although monetary policy has played a relatively, relative to fiscal policy, less of a role due to the dual nature of the crisis being both a supply and demand shock, the current low inflation environment has allowed for slightly more room for governments to implement unconventional monetary policies. Although the low inflationary environment does reflect the weak aggregate demand conditions, it does tell us that it does allow monetary authorities space to adopt expansionary measures by lowering their policy rates, legal reserve requirements, and expanding the money supply. And so this has allowed for some additional maneuver room in a situation with little fiscal space. However, at the same time, with both supply and demand affected by the pandemic, monetary policy has had limited ability to drive demand. And now I will transition back to Van.
Thank you, Zeb. So from what stands out from the three presentations we've seen thus far is that the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic have been immediate, and it's been devastating for our people and for our economies. But at the same time, we've also seen the immediate responses from our each of our countries to save lives and to ensure the social and economic stability in each of the countries. And of course, as the world plans for a post-pandemic recovery, in the words of the UN Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, we need to build back better with more sustainable, more inclusive, gender equal societies and economies. And so in light of that, allow me to share a few priority areas for building back better. And these are built based on our analytical work on the pandemic thus far, and also for Asia and the Pacific, it's aligned with the resolutions of our member states, such as that of the 76th Commission session this year in May. So first is looking at the priority, next slide, please. First is the priority, looking at economic recovery. The focus on economic efficiency thus far in the past decades has come at the cost of rising inequalities, has come at the cost of leaving the most vulnerable at risk of being left behind. The recovery from the pandemic provides an opportunity to ensure that the recovery is inclusive and it is sustainable as the important underlying principles in the 2030 agenda for sustainable development by 2030. At the same time, we also see that the rates of fiscal efforts are expected to mitigate the impact of the pandemic and will need to be sustained over time. So looking ahead, as a priority areas, it will be necessary to identify how economic recovery facilitated through expansionary fiscal and monetary policy measures can be sustained over time and could be aligned with the SDGs and other international agreements. And of course, in doing so, with particular attention to debt sustainability in the context of increased public expenditure. Next is the task in terms of supply chains. So the pandemic has exposed the risk to international trade, especially when the supply chains disruptions occurred. And it has put spotlight on the need to ensure that supply chains are both efficient and resilient as critical building blocks to prepare for future crises. And the COVID-19 pandemic is absolutely a case in point. So moving ahead, it will be important to identify how we can build resilience in supply chains, including access to critical goods. And a number of avenues for building resilience could be explored, including through regional and sub-regional coordination, through the promotion of trade, transport, and digital connectivity, and including many of the existing mechanism, agreements, and initiatives. The third priority area, it's in terms of social protection, and this has come in line, particularly in the context of the COVID-19. It has laid bare the fragilities and the vulnerabilities of many of our communities. And even worse, many are even too invisible to even make the figure. So it has put a spotlight on the need to provide necessary social protection for people to fall back to in times of sickness or in times of unemployment. In Asia Pacific, for example, our analysis shows that if the region increases its investment spending on social protection to match the global average of 11.7%, then more than 300 million people will be lifted out of moderate poverty, and more than 50 million people will be lifted out of extreme poverty. So in light of the longer term recovery from this pandemic, it will be critical to look into the protection of people, especially the most vulnerable and the most invisible. A number of avenues can be looked into, including social protection policy and modalities, as the example that I just given. The mechanisms for supporting small and medium enterprises, and through the use of innovative use of technologies and ways to promote better availability of data and statistics, such as geospatial data, such as civil registration and vital statistics. Lastly, the experience during the lockdown has shown certain benefits, though temporarily, in terms of lower carbon dioxide emission and better air quality. And I refer back to the presentation by the colleague in Fealac, that it is possible to look into to build a greener society, a greener economy after this pandemic. So as we look into the long-term recovery, it's time to lock in these potential environmental gains and ensure that our ecosystem are protected and are restored as a means to build resilience for future pandemics and, of course, building back better. And in doing so, there are a few avenues that we can explore together through cooperation on air pollution, which is a transboundary issue, climate change, and biodiversity conservation. So this has taken me to the task that we were given by the Fealac Cyber Secretariat to undertake the analysis of impacts and the priorities for building back better as a proposal that we recently developed in response to the request from the Cyber Secretariat. So jointly with ESCAP and ECLAC, we were developing a proposal that for special reports examining the socioeconomic impacts and the how-to of the long-term recovery. So essentially, without going into too much details, so the proposed reports and analysis will examine the social economic impacts in each respective region and the pathways for medium and longer term recovery. And this is done in recognition of the different challenges and needs in both regions. The presentation today, our joint presentation today, builds on the work of both commissions so far, and the proposal is an opportunity for us to look at the social economic impacts in a more structural manner and offer a comprehensive analysis of potential pathways for recovery and to build the resilience for future crises, one such as COVID-19. So colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we thank you for your attention, and of course we invite you to visit our resources presented in this presentation for more details of our work.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ban Nguyen and Mr. Zeb Kreiter. How impressive the joint presentation. That reminds me of online orchestra, right? One presenting from Santiago, Chile, the other presenting from Manila, Philippines. Really wonderful. They emphasized, first of all, the Latin American economic growth impact down to minus 9.1% in GDP and minus 23% in exports. And like in East Asia, Latin America also suffer from impact in tourism sector. And particularly more people fall into poverty and extreme poverty categories. Many negative aspects. On the other hand, policy responses in fiscal stimulus and expansionary monetary policies. The good news is we had a precondition of low inflation. So there was no immediate risk by fiscal stimulus and expansionary monetary policy. But the bad news is, as far as there is a very low supply and demand, there should be the impact or the outcome can be quite limited. And on the other hand, they also suggested the important agenda for the economic recovery phase.